So, welcome everyone. Apologies for a bit of delay and technical details that need to be attended to. Could I first just check if you can hear me? And if you can hear the questions, then that's a good thing. Good, it's working. Beautiful. All right. Well, welcome everyone to this chapter, this session on Jakob Rinpoche's Sword of Wisdom, the Nyingma approach to valid cognition. And as always, kindly recognizing the relevance of this in terms of the suffering that pervades our samsaric condition and the wish to establish all sentient beings at the level of perfect enlightenment, we begin with what we call preparing with bodhicitta. So we begin with the enlightened attitude. And then invoking the wisdom of Jamgon Mipham Rinpoche. Through the blessing of awareness, emptiness, Manjushri Kumara, you open the expanse of wisdom and its 8 minds of confidence, thus mastering the vast treasuries of transmission and realization. Mipham Manjushri Gosha, I supplicate you. So, presently in the text, we're looking at the intentions, of which we have 2 kinds, the direct and indirect, and these are really just themes that we need to be. This is in the context of the 4 alliances, and this is in terms of us understanding the meaning of the teaching. That's where this is something that's very helpful in terms of us being able to relate to the various teachings that we come across in the Buddhist teaching. So, for example, we come across all these sort of strange statements that sometimes you could say are contradictory. For example, the Buddha saying, I am the Tathagata, I have taught the Dharma. And that's where we think, well, wait a minute, isn't the Buddha supposed to be selfless? And that's where we can very often sort of have some confusion around the nature of the teachings. So this is a little bit being clarified. And of course, we then have famously in the Vajrayana, we have these sort of statements about killing one's parents. But of course, what here is being talked about is the parents of samsara, in the sense of ignorance and co-emergent and conceptual ignorance. I forget exactly what the 2 kinds of self. So in this way, the various teachings that we come across, they need interpretation. We need to be able to understand them. And so that's what we're presently looking at. We've covered the direct intentions, and now we're looking at what's called the 4 indirect intentions. Now, just the thing, because I'm going to be leading a retreat next week, starting this, I think, Sunday or Saturday. I better find out, right? Anyway, that's where the next Wednesday class is cancelled, quite simply because there's no network where I'm going to be. So the next class will be the following Wednesday, November 30, and then I'm going to be in Europe, and I'm landing around that following Wednesday, so that's where that probably won't happen. But December 14 and 21 will happen, except rather than being in the evening, no, this is rubbish. Hold on. This time here. Yeah, exactly. So that's where I'll be doing it around this time in European time, but it will be then in the evening in Australia. So that's right. So this is correct. So 7:30 to 8:30 Australian Eastern Daylight Saving Time. So at 7:30, that's simply because that's also the time that we begin the Thursday studies, the glimpses of the profound. So Wednesday, December 14 and 21, 7:30 to 8:30 Australia Eastern Daylight Saving Time. Okay. Okay. All right, so we're looking presently then at these 4 indirect intentions. And that's where we have what's called indirect intention related to entry, avatara, nabi samdi, shukpan demborgongba, and then we have indirect intention related to characteristics, lakshana bisamdi, seni la demborgongba, and then we have indirect intention related to antidotes, pratipaksha sambisamdi, nyenpola demborgongba, and then we have indirect intention related to change, harinama bisamdi, njorwa la demborgongba, or also known as njurwa la demborgongba. So I apologize for the technicalities of this, but I just found it also a little bit helpful to have the Tibetan in there. But that's where we then hear the Khenpo comments. Second, drawing from the Sanskrit term Chatvebi Samdi, there are what are called the 4 indirect intentions. The ornament of the Mahayana Sutra states, there is no indirect intention related there is the indirect intention related to entry, the indirect intention related to characteristics, the indirect intention related to antidotes, and the indirect intention related to change. Let me just see here. Normally let's see. Yeah, this should have been sitting a little bit apart as a, okay, bear with me because I might be using this text again. So just because I would like to edit it so that it, let's see here. Okay. Good. Okay. So it says here, the indirect intentions are roundabout ways of changing the meaning from the ordinary way of understanding the words. And I'd like to say, I also make a little bit of a disclaimer here. Personally, I find this a little bit confusing, and I don't think necessarily the topic as such is confusing, because of course we all understand that some teachings need to be interpreted, or we have these kind of, we need to understand the intention behind these statements, right? So that's sort of the theme that runs through what we're studying here. But the thing is, some of the explanation here, I have to say, I find a little bit difficult to actually follow the Khenpo. And this, of course, is entirely my fault. But that's where hopefully you'll bear with me. The presenter here is not that confident in some of the things that are being stated here. Anyway, like I always like to say, we're doing this study jointly. So, so there will be places where I'm a little bit weak in the, you could say, confidence, the degree to which I can present this. But at the same time, and this sort of applies universally for the Dharma, it applies that very often that when there are things that we sort of don't get, then it just sort of sits there and eventually it becomes clear. So I think it's worthwhile for us going over this study. So to begin with, the indirect intention related to entry has the purpose of getting Shravakas to gradually engage in the Mahayana teaching. For example, and when we say Shravakas, we refer to these individuals that follow the views and practice of the, you could say the Hinayana level, which is the organic place that anybody would begin the journey. But also, of course, it does sometimes refer to schools that are consolidated and simply stick with that one particular view. And that's where sometimes the Mahayana a little bit sort of challenges the Shravaka or Hinayana view with intention to bring this, to provoke sort of the aspiration to engage in the Mahayana, and also for those following the Mahayana to appreciate the differences. So there's sometimes we could understand Shravakas as something that's an organic part of our own journey. Sometimes we can also see them as schools where there are actually followers who engage uniquely in this. But the thing is, in the Indo-Tibetan Mahayana tradition, these schools, they you could say practically don't really have any other roles than simply being part of a gradual presentation of, you could say, increasingly higher views. And that's where the Shravaka view is associated with still attributing some reality to both, you could say, matter, the external phenomenal world, as well as also consciousness. So that's where we talk about the views of Vibhashika and Sautrantika. These are views that understand dependent arising. They, to some degree, they understand selflessness, but not complete selflessness. So they understand some degree of selflessness in regards to consciousness, some degree of selflessness in regard to both consciousness and phenomena. So that's where we do talk about the intention to bring those who are at a lower level of understanding to a higher level of understanding. And so that's where we talk about the Buddha then speaking to a certain audience with the intention for them to actually arrive at a higher level, and also sometimes the Buddha teaching simply just accommodating the belief systems, or basically what the particular students can handle. So that's where the particular intention we're talking about here, the indirect intention related to entry, this is, like it says, has the purpose of getting Shravakas to gradually engage in the Mahayana teachings. For example, Shravakas know that the individual self does not exist. When the Buddha taught them that the aggregates comprises when the Buddha taught them that the aggregates, the five skandhas, comprising the self do exist, he meant that phenomena exist only on the relative level. So that's again where we talk about the five skandhas as something real. We talk about a real world, we talk about a real experience of being a person. And that's where also we here presently, us, whatever we might choose to define us, we can ask ourselves, do I really think that I do exist? Do I really think that the world does exist? You know, do I really think that London exists? Do I really think that my present body, which I might have some concerns about in terms of health and so forth, that it actually has a reality? And that's why we could see, certainly with regard to myself, I certainly have very vivid elements of, you could say, the Shravaka position. So I appreciate the Buddha speaking about what I think of as a real world out there, and as what I perceive of as a real experience of having a self. So anyway, that's you could say, the skill of the Buddha that accommodates, you could say, where persons are at, with the intention then to eventually take them to a higher understanding. So that's the indirect intention related to entry. And then there's the next one, which throws me a little bit, but anyway, for the indirect intention in relation to characteristics, he uses phrases like, there is no essence in relation to the three natures and primordial nirvana, which apply to ultimate reality. And I'll just tell you how I understand this. This is because in what we call the Greater Madhyamika, we talk about the ways that we can approach the three natures in terms of the confused condition, the not confused condition, or rather the confused nature, samsara, the unconfused nature, which is essentially awakening or liberation, and the nature of that which undergoes this change, which is the subject of the path, right? We have a mind that's changing from confusion into awakening. That we call the dependent nature. And so that's where we have three conditions basic to who we are. We have this ground nature of our consciousness that can fall into confusion, has fallen into confusion, but that also can be freed. And so we talk about three natures. And this is typically the scope of the Shravakas, and also we talk about that in terms of being something that is a reality that we need to deal with. And also from that point of view, also we can talk about this nature that we have. You could say the primordial nature prior to samsara and nirvana as constituting a reality. But that's of course where we need to understand that reality as being something that's entirely intangible. And that's where we can talk about that while we're talking about the three natures, we're talking about primordial nirvana, we're talking about some degree of reality. You know, the Buddha has seen reality, right? But that's where when the Buddha speaks about these natures, then he would say, for those then that might think there's something real, and that's where we often have the sort of the debate with the what we call that between the Rantong and the Shentong. Those that would say, oh, enlightenment is completely non-existent, and those that would say, yes, it's non-existent, but there is nevertheless a vivid experience of it. So that's where we would say there are those that might hold some what we could say a degree of reification, solidifying this ultimate reality. And that's where the Buddha then makes a point about there is no essence. So that's where we could say this is the indirect intention in relation to characteristics, or at least these are some of the perspectives that I, in reading this, think might apply. Those of you who have followed texts like Contemplating Certainty, that I've done some studies on, Contemplating Reality by Andy Carr, and also Progressive Stages of Emptiness by Khenpo Tsultring Gyatso. These are texts that I've studied here in various contexts. But in there we have the discussion of these sort of gradual progression of views. And that's where, when it comes to the Madhyamika, we again have certain, the Yogacarya, and also in the Madhyamika, we have various categories of understanding ultimate reality. And then there's, as for the indirect intention in relation to antidotes, this is again fairly straightforward. That's where the Buddha spoke in certain ways. Khenpo says the Buddha spoke in certain ways to eliminate students' misunderstanding that need to be relinquished. For instance, having the intention related to equality, he said, I was Buddha Vipashin, so that someone holding him as inferior and another Buddha as superior would relinquish their disparagement of him. So that's why some of us might think, well, you know, like I often have this actually, people come say, wow, you met Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. And I said, yeah, I did. But you know, presently we have Tsongsa Khyentse Rinpoche, we have Jigme Khyentse Rinpoche, we have His Holiness Sakya Trinzen. So we shouldn't think like we've missed the boat. And we sometimes might think, oh, there were greater Buddhas in the past. Well, maybe, but as far as the Buddhas of the past go, the only thing they could do for us was to show us the way. And as such, then there's no difference in the Buddha of the past and our present teacher. The Buddhas of the past and the Buddhas of the present that we're encountering, they can only do one thing, and that's show the path. And that's where the Buddha that we presently encounter, the great teachers, are in no way different from the Buddha of the past. It's not like the Buddha of the past could beam us up and the Buddhas of the present can't. So in this way, we would say our teacher and the Buddhas of the past are in no way different. But we do also say that the Buddhas of the present, they exceed the Buddhas of the past in terms of their kindness, because they're actually here and actually teaching us and, you know, putting up with our neurosis and what have you, right? So that's where we would certainly praise the Buddhas of the present as being very kind. The others have passed away. So that's where we then, the Buddha recognizing this and seeing, oh, there would be students who think I'm sort of an inferior Buddha compared to the great Buddhas of the past. He then says, well, you know, in the past I was this Buddha, the Buddha Vipashin. So basically to say there's no difference between the Buddha of the past and the present Buddha. So that's why we have various antidotes, and we actually studied these last time. So I'm going to pass on these, and simply just the text refers to those antidotes that we studied last time. And then finally, we have this one here, the fourth, which is the indirect intention related to change. Refers to changing the usage of terms so that the intended meaning is different from the most common meaning. For example, when non-Buddhist extremists say that the Buddha's teaching is inferior because they're easy to understand, the Buddha counteracted this idea. And that's where there might be those that said, oh yeah, well, this is all very simple. But then the Buddha actually makes a point of sort of intentionally, you could say, blowing their minds. And that's where he says, something that apparently is completely contradictory. He says, or you could say difficult to catch. If one knows that the essence is essenceless, if one knows that the essence is essenceless, is afflicted with the afflictions, and fully abides in what is mistaken, one will attain perfect enlightenment. How's that? If somebody had thought the teaching is sort of easy to grasp, then yeah, if one knows that the essence is essenceless, is afflicted with the afflictions, and fully abides in what is mistaken, one will attain perfect enlightenment. So luckily then for us, then the Khenpo, he unpacks this a little bit. So why did the Buddha say these things? To explain his intention. In the first line, the Sanskrit word sara can mean distraction as well as essence. So one should know that the essence of training the mind is perseverance in non-distraction. So again, this is where the meaning is changed. So again, you could say it's a bit like, what do we have? We have a similar thing in English where, well, there's, double entendre. So that's where the essence here is, yes, essence, but then again, it means this distraction. So that basically means the Buddha is endorsing the practice, or if you say masters not being distracted. And it says it's afflicted with the afflictions. For the second line, since people have difficulties while training in discipline, difficulties are produced. So that's where, yes, okay, the very nature of the path, the practice of non-distraction is, you could say, held by challenges. And that's what we then mean with the difficulties are produced. But of course, also we know that these difficulties are just dependently arisen phenomena. For the third and fourth lines, which read, and fully abides in what is mistaken, one will attain perfect enlightenment. By fully abiding in the higher training of wisdom, which reverses the notion of purity, bliss, permanence, and the self, one will attain perfect enlightenment. Now, this is an important point, and this is something that if you've studied the Buddha nature teachings, on the basis of understanding the middle way, the freedom from conceptual constructs, and basically what we call emptiness, then this reveals Buddha nature. This reveals the unconditioned ground of our being, that which is uncovered when we attain enlightenment. Now that then, and this is where in the Buddha nature teachings, it clearly states this in the Uttara Tantra Shastra. It says purity. They define this nature as purity, bliss, permanent, and self. So of course, if one has that, if one fully abides in this nature, which is Buddha nature, then one attains perfect enlightenment. But what is being said here is, of course, that normally these terms, purity, bliss, permanence, and self, that's exactly what we are on the path that we are, you could say, refuting. We're challenging these assumptions, these four: purity, bliss, permanence, and self. They're known as mistakes. They're known as delusion. But only from the point of view of an unenlightened person, from the point of view of somebody on the path, from the point of view of having established perfect understanding of shunyata, openness, emptiness, whatever we choose to call it. from the point of view of understanding this nature, well, there's Buddha nature, which is, again, something that is permanent, blissful, pure, and a self. And if we abide in that, hey, then we attain perfect enlightenment. And this, of course, is referring to the scope of the Bodhisattvas on the what we call the three pure bhumis, who have seen Buddha nature for what it is. But that's where the Buddha simply says this because he'd like to just blow people's mind. And of course, this very often is also when we have teachers, such as, for example, Sonsei Rinpoche. You know, he'll very often use sort of very sort of unconventional ways of essentially using unconventional language to show us that which lies beyond. Similarly, in the Udana Varga, a collection of verses from the Buddhist canon, the Buddha said, "Kill your father and mother." Again, here these two states, the craving and grasping that propel us into samsara, are like our father and mother. This intention related to relinquishment and all types of similar intentions are called indirect intention related to change. So again, here we see an example of how the interpretation of is dependent. So here, father is not ordinary father, mother is not ordinary mother, but simply just the craving and the grasping. So I was saying before, I think co-emergent and conceptual ignorance, this is not the case. It is here, in fact, what we refer to as grasper and grasped. The craving and grasping, yes. So the craving is situated within the subject, and the grasping is the way in which we identify object. In Tibetan, it's sungzin, which means then the zinpa is the self fixator, and the sungwa is the grasped object. So basically, these constitute also what we sometimes refer to as duality. Grasper and grasped, or craving and grasping. So then we have then summary of the intentions and indirect intentions. For the distinguishing features of intentions and indirect intentions, the great translator, Ngok Lodon Sherab, so I think he's late 12th century, if I'm not wrong. He says, and he's one of the early fathers of the Kadampa tradition. So he's a student of, I think, his uncle, who was one of the three main students of Atisha. So anyway, he was very important as a translator, and he then said, for the intentions, the listener should not understand the meaning intended by the speaker from the speaker's words alone. Instead, he should understand a different meaning. For the indirect intention, the listener should understand the meaning that the speaker intends. Okay, I think we kind of get that. It's a question again of understanding what's behind it. Then it says, from the connected explanation of the compendium of the Mahayana teaching. And then it says the intentions are formulated merely in relation to the mind. One should not accept and rely on them in terms of what is apprehended externally. So not just sort of, again, looking at the words. For the indirect intention, one can rely on what is apprehended externally. And that's why yours truly is slightly sort of not entirely clear on what is meant there. Anyway, the Khenpo says, therefore, having an intention towards an objective basis, such as the aggregates, there are the four indirect intentions and four intentions, which make 8 altogether. These intentions are taught because there could not be correct, valid cognition if the statements were taken literally, and because the purpose of the statements is to benefit specific individuals. So that again, what we're mainly talking about here is our experience of phenomena, which we can sum up in terms of the aggregates, both in terms of mind and matter. But that's where we have these various intentions that address the topic of the way that we perceive our reality. And different persons will be, you could say, reachable. The Buddha would skillfully teach in different ways depending on various individuals. And that's where we then, when we look at teachings that were given to others, we might not understand them, but then the Buddha might have taught to us in particular, where there will be teachings that we can connect with particularly and that make immediate sense. But when we then look at the other teachings, then we just need to understand the meaning behind the words. So to sum it all up, it's about, again, coming back to rely on the meaning, not the words, rely on the definitive meaning, not on the provisional meaning. So this is, again, about us penetrating really to what is being stated and understand that, like like Khenpo says here, the purpose of these various ways in which the Buddha has taught is to benefit specific individuals. The purpose of the statements is to benefit specific individuals. So I hope you're hanging in there. This is, in some way, pretty simple. But of course, what's sometimes, like I've said earlier, sometimes the detail in which it's presented, really intending to clarify further, sometimes can be quite, you could say, challenging in terms of grasping subtlety. So that's why I hope you will be patient with yours truly, who is just an ordinary individual with a deep respect for the subject matter. And nevertheless, some of the details here, not entirely certain about it. Anyway, like I say, we're jointly studying this material, and it is very valuable that we actually don't just leave this material on the shelves or as something that's sort of out there, but we really have no clue about. Us having a look at these words here, I think, will be very helpful. Now, the Vajrayana. And this, of course, is something that is particularly important for us in the modern world, where Vajrayana so often is completely misunderstood. Not only, forget about the Buddhist teaching, forget about the Vajrayana rather, the Buddhist teaching in itself is largely misunderstood. And of course, what we're establishing here is the Buddhist teaching is not based on just belief systems and so forth, but it's very much based on us properly investigating, scientifically investigating, on the basis of what we've studied here before in terms of what can be properly understood with regards to the nature of how things appear and how they actually exist, the two truths. That's where our methodology is founded on what we can directly observe and what we can logically infer. And hence, we are no different from the methodology that we have in any science tradition anywhere, and certainly within our modern world. That particular approach is what gives us all the trust that we have in what we call modern science. So that's where there's what we could say shared epistemic premises between modern science and Buddhism. And that's, of course, also why we have all these dialogues between scientists, philosophers, psychologists, neuroscientists, and so on, and Buddhist teachers. But specifically, when it comes to the Vajrayana, then because the Vajrayana very much is based on already arrived at insights in the Buddhist teachings, such as emptiness and such as the unity of appearance and emptiness, and particularly taking Buddha nature, taking enlightened experience as innate to who we are, as the path, then it operates with a language of yoga in which phenomena are seen in terms of their abiding innate purity. both in terms of our subject, which is understood as deity, and also the external world, which is understood as mandala, when it comes to relative truth. And of course, the ultimate truth, again, is the same across all of the Mahayana, but the Vajrayana is specifically skillful in terms of approaching the ultimate truth. So that's where we can appreciate the Vajrayana in terms of its, you could say, superiority in terms of the general Mahayana teaching. But there are also then particular aspects of the Vajrayana teachings that are difficult to understand, and that's again where we need to look at the meaning. So that's where we're presently then going to be looking at the definitive meaning in the Vajrayana. So Jamgon Mipham Rinpoche here writes, because of his intentions, there are various levels of teachings, from the 4 Buddhist tenets up to the sublime Vajrayana. The aspects that are not understood by the lower levels are clarified by the higher ones. Having seen which teachings are closer to reasoning that accords with scripture, one holds to the definitive meaning. Like swans who can extract milk from water, those of the highest intelligence play in the ocean of the Buddha's speech. So we've already discussed in the teaching, the intentions that apply in the various teachings, and of course that's again where we are having these what we call the study of the 4 reliances here: rely on the teachings, not the teacher, etc. So this applies to what we refer to as the 4 tenets. And the 4 tenets are then again something we touched on a bit earlier. They are the views that gradually increasingly understand the nature of emptiness. And first we have a partial understanding of emptiness as we have it in the 2 first tenets, which are the Vaibhashika and the Suchantika. And then we have an increasing understanding of emptiness as we have it in the Yogacarya and in the Madhyamaka. And that's where you could say the higher ones, they can understand the lower ones, but the lower ones not necessarily able to understand the higher ones. And so that's where we presently are coming at this from the Mahayana, specifically from the Vajrayana. And that's where we have you could say, a superior vantage point that enables us to understand what's meant with these degrees in which we increasingly understand understand emptiness. So that's where, for those that then are able to, you could say, grasp then the what is provisional and what is the definitive. When it comes to the Vajrayana, we then engage with the definitive meaning, which is the unity of appearance and emptiness, and engage in that as the path. And that's where we utilize this language of yoga that engages our experience of our body and our speech, you could say, and all the aspects really are in terms of both what is physical and what is more subtle, and what has to do with particularly then working with our perceptions externally and internally, which is then understood in terms of deity and mandala, and then also the pure nature of our being as being permeated by, we say, purity, the subtle aspects of our body not being conditioned by confusion, but abiding innately as pure. And that's where we talk about the Vajra body, which is then utilized in the Vajrayana. But that comes from a place of understanding the emptiness nature and the reality of emptiness, as we've established in the general Buddhist teachings. But it comes with this additional quality of engaging phenomena skillfully to realize this. And so that's where the Vajrayana operates with a profound insight into the nature of reality. So that's where to approach the Vajrayana, it's very helpful if we have some understanding of what we call the sutra vehicle. So that's where the Khenpo then comments here, specifically with regards to the first verse. Then he says, the 4 Buddhist philosophical schools or tenet systems, Vibhashika, Sautrantika, Chittamatra or Yogacarya, and Madhyamika culminate in the resultant vehicle, which is the secret mantra Vajrayana with its 3 outer tantras, 3 inner tantras, and its apex, the unsurpassable Ati Yoga. Whatever is not understood by the lower schools through investigation and analysis are clarified by the higher ones. And that's where, when we're looking at the skillful means that we have in the various higher vehicles, when we're able to understand their view and understand how the skillful means that we're practicing in, let's say, the tantras, when we understand that and we apply that, then we also are able to understand the lower vehicles. That makes perfect sense. For example, we understand the value of the view that understands emptiness from the Vibhashika and Sautrantika view. We understand that, specifically us in the modern world. The Vibhashikas, for example, they operate with the notion of subtle particles, or rather indestructible particles. And many of us, when we were brought up, which is maybe now a slightly outdated science, we were brought up believing in the atom, that there were atomic structures and so forth. Now, of course, we can say there's sort of more sophisticated ways of understanding the atoms, and even early on, and right from the time of you could say the quantum mechanics, there was very much the understanding that when we talk about atoms, it's really just place markers for what governs our perception of our reality, and that there is something there that operates, which is not necessarily physical, the way that we like to think of atoms, but rather what shifts phenomena. And that again is where we then, within quantum mechanics, we establish that way that phenomena shifts has a lot to do with the one that is observing it. So we have now, you could say, a more sophisticated understanding of physics than we had back in the day when we talk about atoms. But nevertheless, this still prevails. And there's still a notion of some, you could say, physicality out there. And the Vibhashika view is essentially that the phenomenal world is based on these indestructible particles. And similarly, also the Vibhashika, they speak about the observer, the consciousness that knows. They then similarly, just like they talk about out there's a subtle particle, they also, with regards to the subject, talk about how there's subtle moments of consciousness. And so these are the tenet systems that we operate with, and these are sort of basic to understanding the increasingly subtle understanding of how our reality is not solid the way we think it is. So that's where the Vibhashika, Sautrantika, Chittamatra, they are increasingly subtle. When we look at the Sautrantikas, they look more on the way in which we project onto phenomena, and how phenomena ultimately don't exist according to our projections. So you could say the Vibhashika takes an ontological approach, the Sautrantika more an epistemological approach, looking more at the subject. The Chittamatra, again, is more epistemological. It's more saying how whatever we have in our world, these are projections of you could say projections of a mind that, and most Chittamatrans would say this mind is empty, but some would say that mind exists as real, but they would, nevertheless, they would say everything is mind. That's where in the Madhyamika, some Madhyamikans would say that's true, everything is mind, but remember everything that it is empty. And so in some way the Chittamatra and the Madhyamika work very well together. But the bottom line around the Madhyamika is that they really wish to say that nothing has any inherent existence. Relatively, yes, things appear to us when we don't analyze, but when we analyze, you can see there's nothing that we ultimately can assert. So these are the tenet systems in which we have so you could say, and gradually and increasingly sophisticated understanding of our reality, both in terms of the world and in terms of our mind. But when it comes to integrating these perspectives, then we can approach this in terms of thinking of ourselves as ordinary persons, or we can approach them in terms of understanding that, yes, we might be ordinary persons, ordinary confused individuals, but ultimately our ground nature is not confused. And that's where we can operate from the point of view of us presently working with causes and conditions, which is what we call the sutra vehicle, or we can operate from the point of view of our abiding reality when we have eliminated confusion, which is then the resultant vehicle. So one, you could say, looks at the ordinary confused mind, and the other looks at wisdom. So that's where the Vajrayana, of course, is built on the process of eliminating confusion and arriving at wisdom, but it appreciates the perspectives that this process involves. And that's where we have then the tenet systems, which essentially define this gradual progression. And we then have the Vajrayana view that understands all of that, but also understands that all of this leads to wisdom. And it is the wisdom that is then the scope of, and which is integrated in increasingly subtle ways within the Vajrayana vehicle. So then the Khenpo then goes on to comment on 75. He says, the Vajrayana is also greater in terms of what is experienced and realized, which is the topic of its faultless scriptures, meaning the Tantras. So that's where the Vajrayana is greater, because it's taking as its scope this nature of wisdom. This superiority is also established through reasoning, and this we'll be looking at in greater detail. There's actually, let's say, there's reasoning that we used in the Vajrayana. So we'll look at some of it. There's some of it that I will skip over because it's usually regarded as, you could say, restricted material, or something that is viewed as particularly profound in terms of the Vajrayana. So that's where there's a section which continually operates with some quite difficult topics. And again, I'm just thinking in terms of us completing this study, since that really just comes as, you could say, an insert or an addition. It's not essential to the material. We might just skip that part. So there's a little part that we'll be skipping. Anyway, he says, seeing this, one holds purely to the definitive meaning and does not base one's confidence on the provisional meaning. And of course, Vajrayana is based on insight into wisdom. So that's where its scope is continually relating to the definitive meaning. So that's where one does not base one's confidence on the provisional meaning, cause and effect. So that the provisional meaning is associated with cause and effect, and of course the definitive meaning is that which lies beyond cause and effect, beyond the nature of the path and beyond our conventions. And that's where we are able to distinguish that. And then the image that's given here, then the swans, which have this capacity I wasn't aware of, but they can extract milk that's mixed with water. So he says, just like swans who can extract milk when it is mixed with water, those of the highest intelligence are victorious over the warfare of the four maras and playfully enjoy the great ocean of the Buddha's speech. And that's why we're referring then to the Vajrayana, in which then there's confidence in the definitive meaning, and as such, the four maras, or the general, you could say, obstacles on the path, they're easily overcome. And as such, then again, with the image of the swan, then they playfully enjoy the great ocean of the Buddha's speech. They feel at home with whatever teachings of the Buddha they might encounter. So I think we'll leave it at that here. Sorry, I'm going slightly over time. but just for us to make some headway with the material. See if there's some questions. Maybe the idea to bring Shravakas from the, maybe the idea is to bring Shravakas from the idea of liberation to omniscience. Yes, if you understand liberation as the, what we call the Nirod or the Gokpa, yes, that's right. Then the intention of bringing Shravakas onto the Mahayana path is to bring them onto the path of omniscience. Yes. No other questions? Come on, there must be some questions here. Okay, I'll wait a little bit if anybody has questions. So it's provisional inferior. Well, it's not so much that it's inferior because of it's worse or bad, but it's a partial view. So we would provisionally talk about a self, but that's where it makes a lot of sense to talk about a self. For me, it's the provisional makes a lot of sense because that's what I experience. But also I need to understand that that self is the very cause of confusion. And that's where, while I temporarily operate with the notion of self, I think I need to practice. I need to, basically perfect the qualities of the path through, you could say, accumulation of merit and accumulation of wisdom. That is the provisional meaning, but that makes a lot of sense. The ultimate meaning is the ground nature that we have is free from anything that needs to be accomplished. It's primordially there. So you can say the provisional meaning is we are sentient beings that need to accomplish enlightenment. The definitive meaning is enlightenment is already present within us. So that's where the provisional is brought onto the path in terms of skillful means. So that's where, as long as I think of me as a self and I think of me in my body and so forth, I use my body in terms of practicing the path, and I use my mind in terms of practicing the path. But I do that to ultimately arrive at the definitive meaning in which these kind of relative constructs are seen to be without any inherent truth. So it's very important to have a vision of the definitive, but also to relate to the provisional, and particularly in terms of the Buddhist path, we relate to the provisional as the place where we integrate it onto the path through skillful means. Okay, so then there's the question, is cause and effect provisional in the sense that understanding it must have some parameters of reference point? Yes, cause and effect is the very nature of the provisional meaning. Provisional meaning is that yes, we need to operate with our present conditions, but of course with the intention that these present conditions are really just relative truth. Then it says, where in absolute truth there is no end or beginning to the movement of this very apparent cause and effect relationship that we still function by as sentient beings. Yep, yes, that's it. So understanding absolute truth is to understand that the ultimate nature is beyond our ordinary conditions as sentient beings, but provisional truth is what provides the vehicle for us to skillfully integrate the reality of our being as sentient beings so that we can accomplish ultimate truth, the definitive meaning. No questions, but many wows. Grateful to be part of this study group. Thank you. And yes, there will, and I would like to say there will be some other things. For example, I'm going over the tenets, right? They do come up a lot. And when you now heard it, you might have heard about the tenets before, but they just sort of, like if somebody just mentioned them in the passing, They might not really have meant much. But every time we hear references to the various things, you could say it's like we have a big mosaic, a big puzzle. And it's just very satisfying to begin to hear a little bit here and a little bit there. And of course, for some of you, this is familiar material. But if it's not familiar material, then I can reassure you that it'll come up a lot. And as you probably, hopefully now have great confidence in the nature of the Buddhist teaching, you'll understand that this is not just sort of a lot of words, but this is something that's incredibly relevant for us. So to just have that sort of appreciation that, well, I might not get all of it, but I will eventually, just like all the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, if we have the time, eventually they all have a place. And finally we see, fits perfectly, and adds to really giving a very clear understanding of how to engage in the path. And again, this is not just about us having, you could say, being philosophers, but continually operating with the experience of our reality. And of course, for example, we've been talking about the self, and we have to admittedly we have to acknowledge that we do experience self. So that's where we can say, well, I sympathize with the Bhashikas, because they understand that self is a construct, but they're still operating with some notion of the foundations of this self, which are, of course, these singular moments of consciousness. Now, specifically with regards to the tenets, I'd warmly recommend a book by a senior student of Chogyam Trungpa, and also somebody that the Rigpa Sangha and also here in Siddhartha's Intent, in what we call the Melinda Project, have been drawing on. The very knowledgeable and experienced practitioner Andy Carr. And Andy Carr, he wrote a book called Contemplating Reality. And like I said, I presented this material as one of these online studies that I've done. So you can there's some if you want to go into understanding the tenets, then you can find the material there. Presently, if you go on the Siddhartha Intent website, there's now something called the library, and in there you can find all these different courses that I've done, including Contemplating Reality. Okay, I guess that's it. Time's up. And like I said again, the next teaching, the next study here will be Wednesday, the 30th of November, and then I'll be going to Europe, and then the following will be the 14th and 21st of December, and at that time the study will be in the evening here in Australia, 7:30 to 8:30 p.m. Thank you very much. All right. Okay. Just have the dedication. Le dédicace. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. Thank you.